Today we're looking at job number 11960 and it's a faulty Nintendo Switch Lite. This one specifically doesn't power on and there's a reason behind that I'm going to show you in a second. Let's go over to the scope and try to figure out what the blue stuff is at the back of the port. Why is it there and why does it exist? It almost looks like crayon. Bottom pins? Fine, no issues at all. Top ones. Wow, I'll be very surprised if the port is the only thing that is wrong with this device. It all depends on if any current was drawn when they put whatever they put into the charging port. But that is a sight for sore eyes. Let's test and see what current we get with the ammeter. I'm joking, I'm not going to do that. Because of how badly bent the pins are, there is no point in doing that. I would potentially fry whatever's left on this board. On the back of the board, we have M92T36 and the BQ charging chip. There's no point in me measuring around these components at the moment, purely because of the fact that we still have the charging port on the board. Whatever reading I get now with that charging port on will most likely be false. We might have a short on a couple of components if anything was blown when they put the power in, and those shorts might still show even if we take the port off itself. But to get the best accurate reading we can, it's best to take this off. So let's do that now. We are just going to apply some flux around the port area. If we didn't apply flux and then we applied heat and tried to remove the port, if the solder hasn't flown correctly, what might happen is we pull up on this port itself and it can rip pads right around here, and we do not want that. With any Nintendo Switch charging port that I do, I always go from the bottom side of the board. It's especially good with a Switch Lite because down here, down the south side, we actually have a plastic connector. If you come in with heat from the top, you have to either cover it up or be extremely careful. And as soon as we see the solder wet in the ground holes, that's when I'll be looking to pull it up. So I'm just going to give it a nudge now. No, it's still solid. And you can see the solder starting to wet now. Give it a poke. Still, it's a little bit looser, but not ready. Moving around the heat as much as we can. There we go. You can see it's completely loose now. Just make sure on the traces, hold it for a little bit longer, and then slowly but surely, there we go. Very clean port removal. Whilst the board is hot, I come in with my solder sucker, and I keep that board hot and clear out the ground holes. This is my method of doing it. Again, there's so many ways to skin a cat. This is just my preferred method. It's the quickest and easiest method for me, and cleanest as well, I guess. So have to be super careful. Just a lot of practice, time, and patience. There we go. All clean. Looking really, really good. And then we come in with our solder wick and just wick away the solder that we have on the pads. Now there's already flux here, which makes it easy for the solder to come off. And eventually we'll replace this with leaded solder when we put the port back on, a new port. There we go. Now whilst the board is hot, you want to try and give it a clean. I remember when I first started working on Nintendo Switches, this is obviously a Nintendo Switch Lite, but the port removal and placement process is pretty much identical. It's just with the Nintendo Switch Lite, if you go ahead and use a Nintendo Switch port, you then have to Dremel it down, or at least file it down to make sure that it fits into the chassis afterwards. But I remember when I first started doing them, and it was the most difficult thing I'd ever done. It took me a very, very long time to get used to doing it, to finding the correct temperatures, the right amount of heat, what solder to use, etc., etc. And as you can see, we now have a pretty blank canvas to put a new port on. Now, whilst the port's off, we're going to check M92T36 and the BQ charging chip to make sure that we don't have any shorts. Okay, so meter in continuity mode, we're going to check for shorts around M92 first. So we have a short to ground on this cap here. On this middle one right here, that will indicate that M92T36 is faulty. And let's check around the BQ charging IC. No, see, that's absolutely fine. 9 times out of 10 with a dodgy port, the only thing that I've actually seen go bust is the M92T36. So let's get this swapped over. And the way that we do this is just apply the tiniest bit of flux. Don't need too much to remove it. And slowly but surely, it will come off the board. And then we can just go ahead and put the other one on. Coming off the heat, we'll apply some more flux in a second and reflow the chip. There we go. And now we're going to reflow. And the chip should just move into place like it just did. And we come off, let it cool down, then we come back in with some isopropyl alcohol and just clean up. Just make sure our workspace is nice and tidy. There we go. And then just to make sure that we don't have to redo our work, I like to apply some flux around the edges and just go around the edges to make sure that we have secure connections. And there we go, all good. And now we check our work. So we look good on this side. We look good on that side. We look hunky-dory on this side. And the final side, how do we look? Yep, wicked. Let's check, shall we, to see if the short's gone. We are not wanting to hear a beep. Okay, here we go. No beep on these caps. Good. So it shows that the short is gone on M92 T36. Sweet. Now what we can do is put the port on. And this is something that I never used to do. I never used to tin the port for a Nintendo Switch. But I do now. And the reasoning behind it is it makes the bond between the pins on the underneath and the pins at the top, I guess, a lot more secure. Just to ensure that there is a solid connection. There we go. Now we place flux on the actual board itself. Start with filling up the ground holes. Clean the soldering iron tip. And then simply just go over the pads. And make sure they're tinned, all ready to go. Which they are now. Perfect. And we use the exact same method that we just used to put the port on. All I do personally is lower the temperature on my heat gun by a little bit. But it's the identical process. Wait for all of the solder to melt. Once it has, we go ahead and put the port on and we hold it there until the solder solidifies. So I'll try and show you this in real time, just so you can see how long it actually takes. This is the patient part, you see. It's quicker than taking the port off because we now have leaded solder rather than the unleaded that would have come from the factory. But as you can see, it's starting to melt nicely. Liquefy. You have to wait until they're all liquefied. The one down the bottom is usually pretty stubborn. And sometimes you do need to put the port on. So we try now. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so we're just going to sit the port down. You see, it's still floating in the air, right? Just going to gently tap it. Just in the places that it needs to be tapped. It's still not sitting flush. You need to make sure that the port sits flush. Because otherwise we're not going to get solid connections. Still not flush. There it is. And now it's sat down as it should. Just giving it a little bit more heat. Pushing down. A little bit more heat. Moving the heat around so I don't burn the plastic on the underside. And then coming off. Keeping that held down. Keeping it held down. Making sure that we get a nice solid connection. Waiting for the solder to solidify. Try and say that 3 times in a row. Keep it held down. You can see it slowly but surely. And we should be good. And now, my most important thing is a nice clean. The hotter it is when you put the IPA on to clean, it's easier to clean. So I do like to try and get it on not as quick as possible, because you want to make sure that everything is dry and that you don't start knocking components off. But that's looking like a really good port. And we'll check the underside in a second. There we go. A couple little fibres that we need to get rid of, which will always happen if you're using cotton buds. And let's just zoom in real quick, shall we? And check how solid these pins are. They look pretty tough to me, but we will just check over them. So we're just giving them all a little bit of a nudge. Okay, so we do have some that are pretty loose. A lot of them actually that are pretty loose. Okay, in which case we're going to reflow, try and push down and create that solid bond again. I'm also just checking to see if the port is flat. And it does look pretty flat, if I'm being honest with you. It does look pretty flat. What I'm looking for here is any of these bits that are raised up, but it looks pretty good if you ask me. I'll reflow it again, put a bit more flux on and see if we can sort it out. Here we go, just a tad more flux here. I'll put it a little bit on the anchoring points as well. Okay, let's give it a go. And I said a little bit. I meant a little bit, not a lot. Now it might be a little bit trickier because you need to move the heat quicker so that we don't burn the plastic underneath. It could just be that a tiny little bit of the port isn't set down correctly, maybe at the back. And that's why those pins aren't sitting flush. Some of them were, but majority weren't. So we're just going to get the port nice and hot. Get the board nice and hot. And then again, once we see the solder molten, I'm going to hold it down for quite a bit this time. There we go. So everything's molten, which is what we want to see. I'm just going to hold that heat and push down again. Just focusing on those pins at the back as well. And coming off. Keep holding down. There we go. Solder is solidifying. Now I can let go. And now clean. Okay, let's inspect again. Did we do a better job this time? Okay. We still have a couple of pins that are loose. It's less than last time, which is good, but I'm just going to go over the pins very quickly with a soldering iron. What we want to do here is just ensure that everything on this side is connected. Sometimes I'm torn between replacing the whole port or just touching up some of the solder joints that we have here. If it's only a couple of pins, which in this case, it looks to be about 3 or 4 pins that are loose, I'll go ahead and just use the soldering iron to make sure they're nice and secure this side. If I've got like a whole row that's loose, I'm not going to be confident that the row under here, which I can't reach with a soldering iron, is going to be solid. So therefore I would just replace the port. It could be that some of the pins were bent on this port slightly, and that's why it's not sitting flush. And the only way to double check is by charging the port both ways. So let me just quickly secure these pins. I'm not going to use any more solder. I'm just going to use the solder that I have on the pin and the pad. And a small iron, a small tip iron should I say, just to go over them. However, this pin here looks like it's not getting enough heat. So I'm going to go over to my slightly bigger iron. And then worst case scenario, I will just add solder. We should be okay with this. There we go. Another quick clean. And we come back in for another push test. How are we looking now? Okay, now every single one is solid. Just checking along the back of the port as well, and that seems absolutely fine. Could do with just a little clean. So now that we have established there are no shorts around M92T36, which is the power management IC, and we have replaced the USB-C charging port on this Nintendo Switch Lite, I'm going to put in the charging cable with an ammeter on the end of it. And this little device is used for testing. I just want to make sure that we get a charge both ways on the port. So we get a good click. We get some sort of reading. That's a good reading, 15 volts. That's perfect. And then do we get something on the other side? So if I take this out and turn the board over, Do we get a reading on this side as well? It lights up, which is always good news. 15 volts, perfect. So that is looking like a successful port swap. And there's only one way to find out, and that's to test it in the housing, not just as we did test it, but in the housing. And here we have the Nintendo Switch Lite working exactly as it should with no issues at all. The charging works both ways as well. Thank you for watching.